I am delighted to be joined from Washington by Stacy Foster, who's been in the States covering for Dan while he's been away. And it's been quite a busy week for you, hasn't it, Stacy? Even from the very moment your plane touched down. Just run me through that first of all.
Yeah, I got on a plane at London Heathrow heading for Washington, only to be told mid-air that actually I'd be going to Los Angeles. So as soon as we landed in Washington, it was a quick turnaround, straight on the first plane out of Washington to head to LA, where there were protests. And I do not know. I think I arrived in Los Angeles at about midnight. We were filming on the streets of LA until about 3 a.m. I'd got my luggage with me. And that's kind of sometimes how it happens. But it was a crazy turnaround. And so now back on the East Coast in Washington, I'm still not quite sure what time it is. But it's getting
that's over a week later.
I know.
What was it like out in LA then, Stacey? You know, thrust right into the middle of a major story as soon as you landed.
Yeah, what we saw was trouble, if you want to call it that, confined to a few blocks of downtown Los Angeles. That first night when I arrived, the police had it under control. Most of the protesters had left the area. The second evening, we saw the National Guard protecting those federal buildings. And what we saw was the LAPD, supported by traffic police and the sheriff's department, controlling the crowds. At no point did we see the US military, the Marines, on the streets of LA. And actually, you know, it looked like the police had got a hold on this, particularly after the mayor had called that curfew at 8 p.m., which meant that crowds were told to leave the area or face arrest. It really felt like law enforcement on the ground at state level had a control on it at that point. At no point did we feel like the whole of LA was going to be on fire, as Trump put it.
Was there a sense, did you think, that this was the politicization of the military?
Yeah, I think what we saw was this ongoing dispute. This wasn't the first time that Trump and the state governor, Gavin Newsom, had gone head to head on issues. And I think what we saw was Trump getting involved in something that perhaps could have been dealt with at state level. As I say, we saw the National Guard in front of those federal buildings. Legally, that was all that they were able to do. But what we saw on the streets was the LAPD actually getting quite hands-on and policing these protests as they turned into violent protests later on in those evenings.
And Stacey, you know, now you're back on the East Coast. You got to witness yesterday the full-on military parade through Washington. That was, you know, celebrating 250 years of the U.S. Army. But I guess that, you know, the irony can't be lost that, you know, there was yesterday Trump celebrating his armed forces for battles they've won, successes they've had. But actually, the week previous, he deployed them onto its country's own streets. What was the parade like yesterday?
I mean, it was quite something to be there. I managed to, it was difficult to actually, not knowing the real lay of the land here, actually, heading down there as a normal person trying to get to the front and see this parade. And I felt like I was in a queue for hours, really. But then once I managed to get to near the Washington Monument, I was able to, you know, the crowds dispersed. I was able to see quite a lot of the parade. But what I found really interesting was there were these huge barriers, you know, 7 foot tall in some places, which meant that your whole view was obscured. So I could only see this parade through a fence, which is not how it was shown on television. But it was a real, you know, to witness what I saw on the West Coast and then to see on the East Coast this display of American strength. But, you know, just a few days earlier, the US military were being deployed on the streets. Their whole role is to protect the American people. It was a real, I mean, just the juxtaposition of that was just, incredible to see, these tanks rolling down the streets of Washington, D.C., something that we've never, ever seen before. And the rain threatened to rain on Donald Trump's parade. It didn't. And he
I see what you've done there, Stacey. Very clever.
Yeah, well, the first thing he said about the parade, actually, after it was, well, the weather forecasters got it wrong, didn't they? It was fine. It was all fine. And yeah, there were just
fake news
showers. Oh, gosh, yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't just about celebrating the army, of course. It was his 79th birthday. So nice do if you can hold one such like that.
Yeah, I mean, the line has been this was the 250th anniversary of the US Army, but let's not forget, yes, it was Donald Trump's 79th birthday, and he did get his happy birthday, although it wasn't perhaps the full song that he wanted, but I think what was remarkable was just to see this happening. It's something that he wanted in his first term. He'd seen the Bastille Day celebrations in France. He sees other countries putting on these huge displays, and he wanted a bit of that for himself. And I think in his speech, which was actually one of the shorter speeches that he's given at an event, I think just around 10 minutes, and he said it was time for America to celebrate its victories, which I think was really interesting to hear him speaking in that tone on that evening, which of course was not only the anniversary of the US Army, but also his 79th birthday.
Thanks to their extraordinary service and devotion, 250 years later, America stands tall, America stands proud, and America stands free. We're the hottest country in the world right now, and our country will soon be greater and stronger than ever before.
Well, I mean, I've witnessed those kind of military parades once in North Korea, even several in China when I was out there. And to be honest, I did expect it to be a bit more flashy out in Washington yesterday. But of course, it was, obviously overshadowed as well by the turmoil that's going on in the Middle East and the assassination of the lawmaker and her husband in Minnesota. But what I did notice, which, I guess is perhaps not surprising, is, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he was yawning. And then I think one of his intelligence officers, was on his phone constantly. Everyone's focus was not on Donald, was not on this military parade, as perhaps they thought that it would be a week ago.
Yeah, it did feel at times a little bit flat. And I think we got that even in how Happy Birthday was sung at that point as well. There were times where it did feel a little bit lacking that, pizzazz that we always see around Donald Trump. So I'm not entirely sure whether that was because of events that have happened in the US this week overshadowing this military parade. I think also it was interesting walking through Washington yesterday. This city has had to deal with so much disruption because of this parade. There were tourists trying to get a view of the White House yesterday who simply couldn't because all the crowd barriers are still in the way. That huge stage that was erected for Donald Trump to watch this parade was still up. There was construction workers trying to take it all down, and people were getting frustrated that they couldn't actually enjoy the monuments of this city. So yeah, I do get a sense that actually it wasn't quite the parade that they hoped for.
I'm just going to correct myself, Stacey, and it was his Middle East envoy who was actually on his phone, not a security chief. The other thing, as while this was all going on over the weekend, there were huge protests in cities across the country, weren't there? These No Kings protests. What essentially were they all about? I mean, obviously against Donald Trump, but what more than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea, isn't it, that military parades are seen in they are something that a dictator would want to put on in their country. And I think the No Kings movement is seen as as a rejection of authoritarianism. We saw in Washington, actually, there was pockets of protests once again at certain points around the parade, but there wasn't one central large display of protest here, and that's probably because of the huge policing operation around this parade. But certainly across America, these No Kings protests spread. We saw the protests in LA, but we also saw a huge display in places like San Francisco, New York. There was a real show and a real rejection of Donald Trump and his policies across the country. And he said, didn't he, that these protests would be really harshly policed. He said that he hadn't even heard about any protests that were due to be taking place on the day of this parade, but they did, and the protesters were out in numbers. And I think what this shows is a country that is really divided on lots of issues, but particularly around its president and his policies.